I remember the exact moment everything changed. Not because it was dramatic or earth-shattering, but because it was so quiet, so ordinary. Just another Tuesday evening in the university library, fluorescent lights humming their familiar tune above our heads, casting that harsh, clinical glow that made everything look slightly unreal. I was leaning across the table, my finger tracing the margin of Jameson's notebook, where he'd scrawled his messy attempt at differential equations. The paper was worn soft from erasing, little gray smudges marking his frustration. His handwriting had always been terrible, letters tilting and cramming together like they were trying to escape the page. I'd grown used to deciphering it over the past few weeks of our study sessions. The formula we were working through wasn't particularly complex, not really. Just basic calculus, the kind of problem I could solve in my sleep. But Jameson had been struggling with it for the better part of an hour, his jaw clenched in that way it got when he was fighting with something that refused to make sense. I'd watched him work through the same steps 3 times, making the same error at the same point, and finally I couldn't stand it anymore. So I leaned closer, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his shampoo, something clean and woodsy that reminded me of rain on cedar. My voice was steady as I walked him through it step by step, pointing out where his logic had gone astray. I was being careful to speak quietly because we were in the library, after all, surrounded by the hushed concentration of other students buried in their own academic struggles. But as I spoke, I became aware that something was wrong. Jameson had gone very still beside me, his pencil frozen mid-calculation. I could feel the weight of his attention, but not on the page between us. When I glanced up, expecting to find him following along with my explanation, his eyes weren't on the notebook at all. They were on me, on my mouth, specifically, watching the shape of words. I was no longer sure I was speaking correctly. There was something in his expression I'd never seen before, something that made my chest tighten and my throat go dry. His pupils were dilated despite the harsh library lighting, and there was a flush creeping up his neck above the collar of his worn gray sweater. I stopped talking. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant sound of pages turning and the soft scrape of chairs against linoleum somewhere in the maze of stacks behind us. Jameson's jaw worked like he was trying to swallow something difficult, and then the words came out in a rush, too quick and too loud for the reverent quiet around us. "You're distracting me." I blinked, feeling stupid and off balance. For a moment, I thought maybe he was joking, the way he sometimes did when the material got too heavy and he needed to break the tension. I waited for his crooked smile, for the laugh that usually followed his more ridiculous observations. But it didn't come. Instead, his pencil rolled from his fingers, clattering against the table with a sound that seemed impossibly loud. Neither of us moved to catch it. It rolled to the edge and dropped to the floor with a small, hollow sound that echoed more than it should have in the space between us. The weight of what he'd said settled over our table like a physical thing. Not the words themselves, exactly, but the way he'd said them. The crack in his voice. The way his hands had started to shake just slightly, fingers pressed flat against the surface of the table like he was trying to anchor himself to something solid. I should have laughed it off. Should have made some joke about my teaching methods, or suggested we take a break. Should have done anything except sit there staring at him while my heart started to pound against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Because I knew, suddenly and with perfect clarity, that we weren't talking about calculus anymore. We'd been meeting like this for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Jameson showing up to our scheduled sessions, looking increasingly frayed around the edges, his usual restless energy transmuted into something more dangerous. I told myself he was just stressed about exams, that the pressure was getting to him the way it got to everyone this time of year. But now, looking at him across a table littered with textbooks and crumpled paper, I could see that I'd been lying to myself. The tension that had been building between us wasn't academic anxiety. It was something else entirely, something that had been growing in the spaces between our conversations, in the moments when our hands accidentally touched, reaching for the same pen, in the way his eyes would linger on me when he thought I wasn't looking. The library felt suddenly too small, too warm despite the aggressive air conditioning that usually left us both shivering by the end of our sessions. Around us, the familiar sounds of studying continued. The soft whisper of highlighters against paper, the muffled typing from laptops, the occasional frustrated sigh from someone wrestling with their own impossible problems. But it all felt distant now, like we were sitting inside a bubble that separated us from the rest of the world. Jameson was still staring at me, his expression raw and unguarded in a way that made my stomach flip. I could see him struggling with something, his lips parting like he wanted to say more, then closing again. His breathing had gone shallow, and there was a wild look in his eyes that reminded me of an animal caught in headlights. I should have said something. Should have asked him what he meant, or suggested we call a night, or done literally anything to break the spell that seemed to have fallen over our corner of the library. But I couldn't make myself move, couldn't make myself look away from the naked vulnerability on his face. Because the truth was, he was distracting me too. Had been for weeks, if I was being honest with myself. The way he chewed on the end of his pen when he was thinking. The way he ran his hands through his hair when he was frustrated, leaving it sticking up in soft brown tufts that made him look younger than his 21 years. The way he'd started sitting closer to me at each session, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, close enough that when he leaned over to look at something I'd written, his shoulder would brush against mine and send electricity shooting down my spine. I've been telling myself it didn't mean anything, that I was reading too much into innocent gestures, projecting feelings that weren't reciprocated onto someone who was just being friendly. But now, with his admission hanging in the air between us and his pencil lying forgotten on the floor, I couldn't maintain that fiction anymore. The silence stretched on, heavy with possibility and terror in equal measure. In the distance, someone's phone buzzed against the table, and the sound made us both jump slightly. Jameson's eyes darted away from mine for the first time since he'd spoken, and I watched color flood his cheeks as the reality of what he'd said seemed to hit him. I could see him starting to retreat, to build the walls back up that had just come crashing down. His mouth opened, probably to take it back, to laugh it off as a joke or blame it on stress or exhaustion or anything except the truth that was now sitting naked between us on the library table. And in that moment, I realized I had a choice to make. I could let him take it back. Let us both pretend this had never happened and return to our safe, careful friendship built on differential equations and academic deadlines. Or I could lean into the truth he'd accidentally revealed, acknowledge the electric current that had been running between us for weeks, and see where it led us. The choice felt enormous, world-shifting. Even though we were just two college students sitting in a library on a Tuesday night, surrounded by the detritus of academic stress and the quiet desperation of exam season. Even though nothing had actually happened, yet except for 4 words spoken too quickly in a moment of unguarded honesty. But sometimes that's how the most important moments arrive. Not with fanfare or drama, but with the quiet confession of a distraction that has become impossible to ignore. I suppose I should explain how we got here, how 2 people like us ended up sitting across from each other in this particular corner of the library, surrounded by the careful architecture of academic desperation. I've always been the dependable one, the kind of person who color codes his notes with a system so precise it borders on obsessive. Blue for definitions, green for formulas, red for things that will definitely be on the exam. My professors know they can count on me to turn assignments in early, to sit in the front row with questions prepared, to be the student who actually does the reading before class instead of skimming it 5 minutes beforehand. It's not that I enjoy being seen as responsible, exactly. It's more that I've never known how to be anything else. Order feels safe to me, predictable in a way that chaos never could. My dorm room is arranged with military precision, textbooks lined up by subject and height, my desk cleared of everything except whatever I'm working on at the moment. My friends joke that I probably schedule time for spontaneity, and they're not entirely wrong. Jameson is everything I am not. He's brilliant. There's no question about that. The kind of brilliant that makes professors shake their heads in frustrated admiration when he shows up to class having clearly not done the reading, but somehow manages to contribute insights that reframe entire discussions. His mind works in ways mine doesn't, making connections that leap across disciplines and find patterns where others see only chaos. But brilliance without discipline is a dangerous thing, especially in college. His grades hover perpetually on the knife's edge between passing and disaster. Not because he can't do the work, but because he approaches deadlines like suggestions rather than requirements. I've watched him write entire papers in the last 4 hours before they're due, fueled by panic and whatever energy drink he can find in the vending machines. His notebooks are disasters. Pages torn and folded, covered in doodles that somehow relate to whatever concept he's trying to grasp. Equations started and abandoned mid-calculation when his attention inevitably wanders to something more interesting. Where my notes are careful transcriptions, his are archaeological sites, layers of thoughts built on top of each other until the original idea is buried beneath weeks of accumulated distraction. We met in Professor Chen's advanced calculus course, thrown together by the random cruelty of assigned seating. I spent the first few weeks quietly horrified by the state of his academic life, watching him scramble for borrowed pens and forgotten assignments with the kind of fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. He spent those same weeks making jokes that were too clever for someone who supposedly hadn't done the homework, sketching elaborate marginalia that somehow illustrated mathematical concepts better than the textbook diagrams. The library became our compromise. It started when he approached me after a particularly brutal midterm, running his hands through his hair in that way he does when he's overwhelmed. He said he was going to fail if he didn't get his act together, that his parents were already threatening to cut off his funding if his grades didn't improve by winter break. He asked, with the kind of desperate politeness that comes from swallowing pride, if I might be willing to help him study. I should have said no. Should have recognized even then that spending time with Jameson outside the controlled environment of the classroom was going to complicate things in ways I wasn't prepared for. But there was something in his expression of vulnerability that contradicted his usual careless confidence, that made it impossible to refuse. So we started meeting here, in this corner of the third floor where the fluorescent lights cast everything in shades of institutional beige, and the heating system ensures a constant background hum that drowns out most distractions. The table we've claimed as ours sits between two towering stacks, creating a pocket of privacy in the otherwise open floor plan. It's close enough to the windows that we get natural light during afternoon sessions, but far enough from the main walkways that we're not constantly interrupted by the foot traffic of other students. The space has become familiar in the way that shared places do. I know which chair creaks when you lean back too far, know that the table wobbles slightly if you put too much weight on the left corner. I've memorized the sight of Jameson's textbooks scattered across the surface, his phone charging from the outlet behind his chair, the way he always claims he works better with his legs stretched out under the table, even though it means our knees occasionally bump together in the cramped space. 3 weeks we've been doing this. 3 weeks of scheduled study sessions that were supposed to be strictly academic, focused solely on bringing his grades up to something resembling respectability. And for the first few meetings, that's exactly what they were. Professional, productive, safe. But somewhere along the way, the dynamic shifted. It started small. Study breaks that lasted longer than they should have. Conversations that wandered from calculus to philosophy to the kind of personal confessions that happen when you're tired and guard down and sitting too close together in the intimate lighting of the library's evening hours. He started arriving earlier, staying later, until our scheduled 2-hour sessions stretched into entire evenings. The campus outside these windows is loud and unrelenting, especially this close to finals. Students rushing between buildings with arms full of textbooks, study groups claiming every available surface, the kind of manic energy that comes from too much caffeine and too little sleep. But inside our corner, with its stacks of books and whispered explanations and the careful distance we've been maintaining across this table, we exist in something like a cocoon. Or we did, until tonight. Until 4 words spoken too quickly shattered the illusion that this was ever just about studying. Now, sitting in the aftermath of his confession, I can see how naive we've been. How we've been pretending that the charged silence between explanations was just concentration, that the way we've been sitting closer and closer each week was just practical, that the electricity I feel every time our hands accidentally touch was just static from the library's dry air. It was never supposed to feel this way. None of this was supposed to matter beyond getting him through calculus. But it does matter. It matters more than I want to admit. For a moment after his admission, neither of us moved. The weight of those 4 words hung between us like something physical, something that had fundamentally altered the air we were breathing. I watched him process what he'd just said, watched the flush deepen across his cheekbones as the reality of his confession settled over him. Then, as if some internal switch had been flipped, he laughed. It was forced, too bright, the kind of sound people make when they're trying to take something back that can't be taken back. He shook his head and reached down to retrieve his fallen pencil, his movements deliberately casual in a way that fooled neither of us. "Sorry," he said, not meeting my eyes as he straightened up. "That came out wrong. I just make you too intense, you know? When you're explaining things, your voice gets all serious and focused, and it's hard to concentrate on the actual math." He was lying. We both knew he was lying. But he'd handed me an escape route, a way to pretend this moment had never happened, and part of me was grateful for it. The larger part, though, felt something that might have been disappointment settling in my chest. I tried to play along, tried to smile, and make some joke about my teaching methods, to redirect us back to the safety of differential equations and academic deadlines. But the words felt clumsy in my mouth, and I could see from his expression that my performance was just as unconvincing as his had been. The thing about lies is that they require both parties to believe them for them to work. And sitting there in our corner of the library, surrounded by the evidence of weeks spent in increasingly intimate proximity, neither of us could quite manage the necessary suspension of disbelief. His foot started tapping under the table, a nervous rhythm that sent vibrations through the floor and up into my chair. It was a tell I'd learned to recognize over our weeks together, a sign that his restless energy was building towards something he couldn't control. Usually it preceded one of his conversational tangents, moments when his brilliant, scattered mind would leap from calculus to philosophy to whatever random thought had just occurred to him. But tonight the tapping felt different, more urgent, like he was using the movement to keep himself from saying something else he'd regret. I tried to focus on the notebook between us, on the half-finished problem that had started all of this. But I kept finding myself watching him instead, noting the way his jaw worked like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite bring himself to speak. His glances kept sliding away from the page, finding my face for brief moments before darting away again, as if he was trying to read something in my expression that he wasn't sure he wanted to find. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Finally, I cleared my throat and pointed to the equation we'd been working on, suggesting we try a different approach. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too careful, like I was speaking to someone who might bolt if I made any sudden movements. He nodded and leaned forward, ostensibly to look at what I was showing him. But as he moved closer, I became acutely aware of the space between us, of how little of it there actually was. His shoulder was maybe 6 inches from mine, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. When he reached for his pen, his fingers brushed against my wrist, just barely, just for a second. The contact sent electricity up my arm, and I saw him go very still like he'd felt it too. That's when he said it, so quietly I almost missed it. I can't focus when you're this close. This time there was no attempt at taking it back, no forced laughter or explanation about teaching methods. He just sat there looking at me with an expression that was part panic and part something else entirely, something that made my heart stutter against my ribs. The statement hung in the air between us, both complaint and confession. I could see him struggling with it, with the implications of what he'd just admitted. His breathing had gone shallow again, and there was a wild look in his eyes that reminded me of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether to jump. I knew I should say something, should respond in some way that would either defuse the tension or acknowledge it. But my mouth had gone dry, and my usually reliable ability to find the right words had deserted me entirely. Because the truth was, I understood exactly what he meant. I've been fighting the same battle for weeks, trying to maintain professional distance, while every instinct I had was pulling me toward him. The careful space I'd been maintaining between us felt simultaneously too much and not nearly enough. Around us, the library continued its evening rhythm. Someone dropped a book several tables away, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. A group of students walked past our section, their whispered conversation fading as they moved toward the elevators. The fluorescent lights continued their steady hum, casting everything in that harsh, clinical glow that somehow made the moment feel both surreal and hyperreal. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the way Jameson was looking at me, the way his admission had shifted something fundamental in the space between us. What mattered was that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross, said things that couldn't be unsaid. What mattered was that I was going to have to decide what to do about it. His foot had stopped tapping. The nervous energy that usually radiated from him had crystallized into something more focused, more dangerous. He was waiting for me to respond, to either run away from what he'd offered or step into it. The choice felt enormous, terrifying, inevitable. I leaned closer, closing some of the distance between us, and watched his pupils dilate in response. Neither of us was pretending anymore that this was about calculus. After that night, everything changed and nothing changed at all. We still met at the same time, in the same corner of the library, with the same textbook spread between us like a buffer against the thing we'd acknowledged but refused to name. We still worked through problem sets and reviewed lecture notes, still maintained the careful fiction that these sessions were about his grades and nothing more. But the air between us had become charged with a different kind of energy, heavy with possibility and unspoken truth. Jameson started sitting closer, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone watching would necessarily notice. Just a gradual migration, his chair moving inch by inch around the table until he was beside me rather than across from me. He claimed it was practical, that he could see my work better from this angle, could follow my explanations more easily when he didn't have to read upside down. But when he leaned over to look at something I'd written, his shoulder would press against mine and stay there just a moment longer than necessary. When he reached for a pen or a calculator, his hand would brush against my forearm, my wrist, the back of my hand, each contact sending electricity racing through my nervous system. I told myself it was accidental. All of it. The way his knee would bump against mine under the table and then remain there, a point of warmth through the fabric of our jeans. The way he'd started unconsciously mirroring my posture, leaning forward when I leaned forward, tilting his head at the same angle when we bent over a particularly difficult problem. But accidents don't happen with such consistent frequency. Accidents don't leave you hyper-aware of every point where another person's body intersects with yours. Don't make you catch your breath every time someone shifts in their chair. Our conversations began to drift more often, straying from calculus into territory that had nothing to do with his upcoming exams. He told me about his childhood, about growing up in a house where academic achievement was the only currency that mattered, where his natural brilliance had never been enough to compensate for his inability to conform to his parents' rigid expectations. I found myself sharing things I'd never told anyone, admitting that my carefully controlled exterior was as much about fear as it was about preference, that order felt safe because chaos had always felt dangerous. These conversations happened in the spaces between mathematical concepts, in the moments when we should have been taking breaks, but instead found ourselves talking in voices that grew softer as the evening wore on, leaning closer together until we were almost whispering despite the fact that we were practically alone in our section of the library. The later it got, the more abandoned the building became, the more intimate our corner felt. By 10 o'clock most nights, we had entire floors to ourselves, just the distant sound of the security guard making his rounds and the hum of machinery, keeping the building alive in the darkness outside. It was during one of these late sessions that I noticed his hands. I'd always been aware of them, the way they moved when he talked, how he gestured to illustrate points that words couldn't quite capture. But now I found myself watching them more deliberately, noting the long fingers that were surprisingly elegant for someone so restless, the way he'd absently trace patterns on the table surface when he was thinking, how he'd started playing with his pen in a way that seemed designed to draw attention to the movement. When he caught me looking, he didn't say anything, just held my gaze for a moment longer than friendship allowed before turning back to his notebook, but not before I saw something flash in his expression that made my stomach flip. His jokes began to falter midway through delivery, replaced by silences that stretched until they became conversations of their own. I'd watch him start to say something lighthearted, see him catch himself, see the words die on his lips as he seemed to remember that we weren't just friends anymore, that everything between us had been recalibrated by admissions we were still too afraid to fully explore. The mathematical problems we worked on became secondary to the tension building between us, background noise to the real equation we were trying to solve. How do two people navigate the space between friendship and something else when neither is brave enough to name what that something else might be? How do you acknowledge an attraction that threatens to derail everything you thought you knew about yourself? Because that's what we were both finally admitting without saying the words out loud. The distraction he confessed to wasn't just about my proximity or my teaching methods. It was about me, specifically about the way I made him feel when I leaned close to explain a concept, about the way my voice affected him when I spoke quietly in the library's hushed atmosphere. And the truth I was still struggling to accept was that the distraction was mutual. I found myself losing track of explanations mid-sentence, distracted by the way the fluorescent lights caught in his hair, by the small sounds he made when he was concentrating, by the warmth radiating from his skin when he sat close enough for me to feel it. I catch myself staring at his mouth when he spoke, wondering what it would feel like against mine, then force my attention back to the notebook between us with an effort that left me shaky. Our study sessions grew longer, extending well past any reasonable stopping point, as we found excuses to stay just a little longer, to work through just one more problem, to continue conversations that had nothing to do with academics and everything to do with the growing need to be in each other's presence. The boundary between studying and something else was eroding with every meeting, every shared laugh, every moment when our eyes met and held just a beat too long. We were both pretending we didn't notice, both maintaining the fiction that these were still just tutoring sessions. But pretending was becoming impossible when every interaction felt like a held breath, when every accidental touch sent sparks through the careful distance we were trying to maintain. It happened on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after his first confession, when the tension between us had grown so thick it felt like breathing through water. We'd been working through a particularly difficult integration problem, one that required multiple approaches and kept leading us down mathematical dead ends. Jameson had grown increasingly frustrated as the evening wore on, erasing and rewriting the same steps over and over until the paper was gray and torn from the repeated assault. Finally, he threw his pencil down with more force than necessary and leaned back in his chair, running both hands through his hair in that gesture I come to recognize as a sign that he was reaching his breaking point. The movement left his hair sticking up in soft brown tufts, and something about the vulnerability of it, the way it made him look younger and more fragile, sent a pang through my chest. God, he muttered under his breath, staring up at the fluorescent lights with an expression of pure defeat. You're making this impossible. I looked up from where I'd been working through the problem on my own paper, confused. Making what impossible? The math wasn't that complex once you understood the underlying principles, and I'd walked him through similar problems dozens of times over the past few weeks. The math? I asked, genuinely puzzled. He let out a laugh that was more exhaustion than humor, dropping his chin to look at me with an expression that was raw and unguarded in a way that made my heart stutter. No, Sidas. Not the math. The way he said my name, with that particular inflection that seemed to wrap around each syllable, made something low in my stomach clench. I set down my own pencil, suddenly aware that we were venturing into territory we'd been carefully avoiding for weeks. What then? I asked, though part of me already knew, had known since that first night when he'd admitted I was distracting him. He was quiet for a long moment, just looking at me with that same intense expression that had been appearing more and more frequently during our sessions. The library around us had grown even quieter than usual, most of the other late-night studiers having given up and headed back to their dorms. We were essentially alone on the third floor, surrounded by towers of books and the gentle hum of machinery, keeping the building alive in the darkness outside. "You," he said finally, so softly I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching his lips form the word. "You're the distraction." The admission hung in the air between us, more complete and honest than anything he'd said before. No attempt to take it back this time, no nervous laughter or explanations about teaching methods. Just the truth, bare and vulnerable and terrifying in its simplicity. I should have said something. Should have asked him what he meant, even though I knew exactly what he meant. Should have made some response that would either diffuse the tension or address it directly. But my mouth had gone completely dry, and my usually reliable ability to find words had abandoned me entirely. Because hearing him say it out loud, hearing him name the thing we'd been dancing around for weeks, made it real in a way that all our careful touches and meaningful glances hadn't. It transformed speculation into certainty, subtext into text. The silence stretched between us, heavy with possibility and terror in equal measure. I could see him struggling with what he'd just revealed, could watch the moment when vulnerability shifted toward panic as he seemed to realize there was no taking it back this time. "Silas," he started, and I could hear the retreat beginning in his voice, could see him getting ready to build the walls back up that had just come crashing down. But before he could take it back, before he could explain it away or turn it into a joke, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the way the fluorescent lights cast shadows across his face, or the way his hands were shaking just slightly where they rested on the table, or maybe it was just that I was tired of pretending I didn't feel the same pull he was describing. Instead of letting him retreat, I found myself leaning forward, closing some of the distance between us. Not dramatically, just enough to make it clear that I wasn't running away from what he'd offered. The effect was immediate. His eyes widened slightly, and I could see his breathing become more shallow, could watch the pulse jump in his throat above the collar of his sweater. We were close enough now that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count the individual lashes that framed them. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, teetering between retreat and advance, between the safe territory of friendship and whatever lay beyond it. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, could hear the blood rushing in my ears, could taste the anticipation that had been building for weeks finally reaching its breaking point. That's when he moved. It was tentative at first, uncertain, like he was testing the waters of this new, dynamic we'd stumbled into. He leaned forward, closing the remaining distance between us until I could feel his breath against my lips, could smell that clean, woodsy scent that had become synonymous with these late-night sessions. For a moment, we just stayed there, frozen in that space between decision and action, both of us afraid to be the one who crossed the final line. Then, with a movement that was both desperate and trembling, he kissed me. It was quick, barely more than a brush of lips against lips, but it sent electricity racing through my entire nervous system. He pulled back almost immediately, his eyes wide with something that might have been panic or wonder or both. I didn't pull away. Couldn't pull away, even if I'd wanted to, because the truth was finally out, fragile and undeniable, and sitting between us on the library table like something that might disappear if we looked at it too directly. But it was there, real, impossible to take back or explain away. The distraction had a name now, and it was exactly what we'd both been afraid to admit. The kiss lasted maybe 3 seconds. But in its aftermath, as we sat staring at each other across the wreckage of our carefully maintained boundaries, it felt like everything had changed and nothing could ever be the same again. Jameson pulled back first, his eyes wide with something that looked dangerously close to panic. I could see him processing what had just happened, could watch the reality of it settling over him like cold water. His breathing was uneven, and there was a wild look in his expression that reminded me of someone who just realized they'd walked too close to the edge of a cliff. "Oh God," he whispered, pressing his palm against his forehead like he was trying to push the moment back into his skull, to undo what couldn't be undone. "Oh God, I shouldn't have." That was... He trailed off, his hand moving to cover his mouth, as if he could somehow take back what had passed between his lips and mine. The gesture was so vulnerable, so utterly unlike the confident, careless persona he usually wore, that it made something twist painfully in my chest. A mistake, he finished finally, the words coming out muffled behind his fingers. That was a mistake. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. We could just pretend it didn't happen, okay? It doesn't have to mean anything. But even as he said it, I could hear the way his voice shook, could see the tremor in his hands that betrayed how much the moment had affected him. He was trying to backpedal, to retreat into the safety of friendship and academic partnership, but his body was telling a different story entirely. I sat very still, watching him unravel, feeling something settle in my chest that might have been resolve or might have been inevitability. Because the truth was, it did mean something. It meant everything. And pretending otherwise was going to be impossible now that I knew what it felt like to have his mouth against mine, even for those brief, electric seconds. Jameson, I said quietly, and the sound of his name seemed to anchor him slightly, made him lower his hand and look at me with those wide, frightened eyes. It already does, I told him, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. Means something, I mean. It already does. The words hung between us like a bridge he could either cross or burn. I could see him struggling with them, with the implications of what I was saying. We both knew there was no going back from this moment, no returning to the careful distance we'd maintained for weeks. The kiss had shattered that illusion completely. Around us, the library had grown even quieter, if that was possible. The building felt empty except for us, suspended in this pocket of fluorescent light, while the rest of the world continued on, unaware that everything had just shifted on its axis for two college students sitting in a corner surrounded by calculus textbooks. But I can't, he said finally, shaking his head like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I can't do this. I don't know how to do this. What if I mess it up? What if I hurt you? What if we destroy everything good between us? The questions spilled out of him in a rush, each one landing like a small wound. I could see the fear behind them, the terror of someone who'd never learned to trust himself with anything fragile or important. His parents had raised him to believe that his natural inclinations were wrong, that his inability to conform was a character flaw rather than simply a different way of moving through the world. Of course he was afraid of ruining this too. You won't, I said, leaning forward until I could almost touch him, until the space between us was charged with possibility again. Or maybe you will. Maybe I will. Maybe we'll both mess this up spectacularly. He looked at me like I'd said something impossible, like the idea of accepting imperfection was foreign to him. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, I continued. That doesn't mean we should walk away from this, because we're scared of what might happen. I could see him wavering, could watch the internal battle playing out across his features. Part of him wanted to run, to protect us both from the potential wreckage of crossing this line. But there was another part, the part that had been drawn to me for weeks, that had finally worked up the courage to admit I was distracting him, that had kissed me despite every rational reason not to. We sat in the silence of that internal war, surrounded by the detritus of our abandoned study session. Our notebooks lay open between us, covered in half-finished equations and eraser shavings, proof that we'd long since stopped pretending this was about academics. His pencil was still on the floor where it had fallen that first night, forgotten in favor of more important revelations. Finally, so quietly I almost missed it, he whispered, "Then don't let me push you away." The words came out broken, vulnerable, like an admission of weakness rather than strength. But I heard the plea underneath them, the desperate hope that maybe, despite his fear and his certainty that he would ruin everything good in his life, I would stay. That I would fight for this thing between us, even when he lost the courage to fight for it himself. I reached across the table then, slowly enough that he could pull away if he wanted to, and covered his hand with mine. His fingers were cold, trembling slightly, but he didn't withdraw from the contact. I won't, I promised, meaning it with every cell in my body. I won't let you push me away. Something in his expression shifted then, like a door opening after being locked for years. The panic didn't disappear entirely, but it was joined by something else, something that looked remarkably like hope. We sat there in the wreckage of our old friendship, our hands touching across the table, knowing that nothing could return to what it was. The choice had been made, not in the kiss itself, but in this moment after, when we decided to lean into the truth instead of running from it. The distraction had won, and neither of us was sorry about it anymore. The library had grown impossibly quiet around us, settling into that deep stillness that comes in the hours after midnight, when even the most dedicated students have finally admitted defeat and retreated to their dorms. The fluorescent lights continued their steady hum overhead, casting everything in that familiar harsh glow that had become the backdrop to so many of our evenings together. But now, sitting with his hand warm beneath mine on the table between us, the clinical lighting felt different somehow. Less institutional, more intimate. Like we were the only two people left in the world, suspended in this pocket of illumination while everything else faded into shadow. The custodial staff had begun their nightly routine somewhere in the distance. I could hear the soft wheeze of a floor buffer on one of the lower levels, the distant clank of chairs being stacked on tables as sections of the building were methodically prepared for tomorrow's invasion of students. But our corner remained untouched, forgotten, a small island of occupied space in an ocean of abandonment. Jameson's breathing had finally steadied, though I could still see traces of wonder and terror warring in his expression every time he looked at me. His thumb had begun tracing small circles against my knuckles, an unconscious gesture that sent warmth spreading on my arm and settling somewhere in my chest. "So what happens now?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper in deference to the sacred hush that surrounded us. It was a fair question, and one I didn't have a complete answer to. The territory we were entering was uncharted for both of us, full of possibilities that were equal parts thrilling and terrifying. But looking at him across our table, seeing the vulnerability in his expression and the way he was holding my hand like it was something precious, I found that the uncertainty didn't scare me the way it should have. "I don't know," I admitted, matching his quiet tone. "But I know I want to find out." He smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all evening, and something tight in my chest finally loosened. Whatever came next, whatever challenges we'd face in navigating this new dynamic between us, we'd face them together. The thought was both daunting and deeply comforting. Our textbooks lay scattered across the table's surface, forgotten monuments to the pretense that had brought us here. Pages of notes covered in his messy handwriting and my careful annotations, problem sets that we'd worked through together, the academic scaffolding that had supported our growing connection week after week. They looked almost quaint now, relics from a time when we'd been able to pretend this was just about calculus. The integration problem that had finally pushed him over the edge remained unsolved on his page, the paper gray and torn from repeated erasures. But neither of us made any move to return to it. The mathematics could wait. Everything could wait, actually, except for this moment and the careful negotiation of what it meant. "You should probably know," Jameson said after a long stretch of comfortable silence, "that I've never done this before. The dating thing, I mean. Not with anyone, really, but especially not with someone who matters as much as you do." The confession was delivered with the same vulnerability that had characterized his earlier admissions, and it made my heart do something complicated in my chest. I squeezed his hand gently, a wordless reassurance that seemed to steady him slightly. "Neither have I told him honestly. So I guess we'll figure out together." The idea of learning this together, of navigating the uncertain territory of whatever we were becoming as equals rather than one of us leading the other, felt right in a way that most of my carefully planned life never had. For someone who thrived on structure and predictability, the prospect of improvisation should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Time seemed to move differently in our corner of the library, measured not in minutes or hours, but in shared breaths and the gradual relaxation of shoulders that had been tense with anticipation for weeks. The heating system cycled on and off with mechanical regularity, sending warm air correlating through the space and carrying with it the familiar smell of old books and industrial carpet that had become synonymous with these sessions. Eventually, inevitably, we would have to leave this place, would have to pack up our things and walk out into the cold night air and figure out how to exist in the real world as whatever we were becoming. We'd have to navigate the reactions of friends and classmates, deal with the practical complications of shifting from friendship to something more, figure out how to balance academic responsibilities with this new emotional landscape we were exploring. But for now, none of that mattered. For now, there was just this, his hand in mine, the quiet understanding that had settled between us, the sense that something fundamental had shifted in both of our lives, and that we were brave enough to see where it led. Our notebooks would remain unfinished tonight, problems half-solved and concepts unexplored. But we learned something more important than calculus in these hours together, something about trust and vulnerability and the courage required to admit that another person had become essential to your happiness. The distraction had become the only thing that mattered, and sitting there in the gentle hum of fluorescent lights with his fingers warm against mine, I couldn't imagine wanting to focus on anything else. Outside, the campus slept. Inside our corner of the library, surrounded by the evidence of weeks spent in careful proximity, we held hands beneath the table and began to imagine what tomorrow might bring. It was enough. It was everything. It was exactly where we both wanted to be.